Have you ever been asked, "What's wrong?" And almost automatically you said, "Nothing." Even when something was very clearly wrong. Maybe you were hurt. Maybe you were angry. Maybe you were overwhelmed. But somehow, explaining it felt harder than carrying it. So you stayed quiet. You changed the subject. You went to your room. You told yourself you would deal with it later. And later became tomorrow. Tomorrow became next week. And eventually, you became so good at keeping things inside that people started describing you as calm. Independent, private, strong. But here's the question. What if some of the things people call your personality are actually behaviors you learned to survive? Because sometimes, the person who says, "I don't need anyone," isn't necessarily the person who needs nobody. They may simply be someone who learned very early that needing people could hurt. And that's where this gets interesting, because emotional suppression doesn't usually begin with a decision. It begins with a lesson, a very small lesson. Something happens. You express something, and you notice what happens next. Maybe you cried, and someone told you to stop being dramatic. Maybe you were angry, and you were punished for expressing it. Maybe you tried to explain why something hurt you, and nobody listened. Maybe you trusted someone with something vulnerable, and later they used it against you. Or maybe nobody did anything obviously cruel. Maybe you simply grew up in an environment where emotions were inconvenient. Everyone had problems. Everyone was busy. Nobody had time to sit down and ask what you were feeling. So you learned something without anyone ever saying it directly. Deal with it yourself. And children are remarkably good at adapting to these lessons. They don't sit there thinking about attachment, emotional regulation, or psychological defense mechanisms. They simply notice. When I cry, people get uncomfortable. When I complain, people get annoyed. When I ask for help, I feel weak. When I talk about what hurts, nothing changes. So the mind adjusts. You stop saying certain things. You stop asking certain questions. You become easier to handle, quieter, more self-sufficient. And eventually, people start praising you for the very behavior that began as protection. You're so mature. You never cause problems. You're so independent. You handle everything so well. And maybe you smile. But there's a strange irony here, because sometimes a child becomes easy, not because life is easy for them, but because they learned not to show what isn't. That child grows up, and the strategy grows with them. Now imagine you're an adult. Someone disappoints you. You say, "It's okay," even though it isn't. Someone crosses a boundary. You say, "Don't worry about it." Someone asks, "Are you upset?" You say, "No." And maybe you aren't consciously lying. Maybe you genuinely don't know what you're feeling yet, because you've spent so much time suppressing emotions that you became better at recognizing what everyone else feels than recognizing what is happening inside you. You can tell when your friend is uncomfortable. You can sense when someone's mood changes. You notice the smallest shift in someone's voice. You can immediately tell when something is wrong with someone you love. But when someone asks, "What do you need?" you don't know. That's a different kind of emotional difficulty. It's not simply that you don't express your feelings. Sometimes you've become disconnected from the process of identifying them. And this is where people misunderstand emotional suppression. They think suppression means, "I feel something, and I consciously decide not to talk about it." Sometimes it does, but sometimes it's much more automatic. The emotion arrives, and before you can even name it, your mind starts managing it. It's not that serious. Other people have it worse. I'm probably overreacting. I'll get over it. There's no point talking about it. And just like that, the feeling gets pushed somewhere deeper. You don't solve it. You simply make it quieter. And there's a difference, because quiet isn't the same thing as gone. That's why someone can say, "I'm over it," while still thinking about it 6 months later. They may have stopped talking about it. But stopping the conversation isn't necessarily the same as resolving the emotion. And here's where the pattern becomes even more interesting. The more often you suppress something, the more natural suppression can become. At first, You have to consciously hold yourself back. Later, you don't even notice you're doing it. Silence becomes automatic. Withdrawal becomes automatic. I'll handle it myself becomes automatic. And eventually, you stop thinking of these things as behaviors. You start thinking, that's just who I am. This is one of the most important things to understand. A repeated coping strategy can eventually look like a personality trait. You may call yourself private. Maybe you are, but maybe part of that privacy comes from fear. You may call yourself independent. Maybe you are, but maybe some of that independence comes from learning that relying on people isn't safe. You may say you don't like conflict. Maybe you genuinely don't, but perhaps you also learned that expressing anger can cost you connection. You may think you're simply calm, but maybe you've become incredibly skilled at disconnecting from what you're feeling before anyone else can see it. And this is where Carl Jung gives us a useful way of thinking about the problem. Jung was interested in the difference between the person we consciously present to the world and the parts of ourselves that don't fit that image. He called one aspect of this social identity the persona. Think about the version of yourself that other people know. Maybe you're the strong one, the reliable one, the funny one, the responsible one, the person who always has advice, the person who never asks for anything, the person who seems unaffected. The persona isn't necessarily fake. That's important. We all have social roles. We all behave differently, depending on where we are and who we're with. The problem begins when you become so attached to one role that you no longer feel permitted to be anything else. If everyone knows you as the strong one, what happens when you become exhausted? If everyone knows you as the calm one, what happens when you're furious? If everyone knows you as the independent one, what happens when you desperately want someone to stay? You may begin hiding those feelings not only from other people, but from yourself. And that's where Jung's idea of the shadow becomes relevant. The shadow isn't simply some evil side of your personality. It's the parts of yourself that you don't comfortably identify with, the feelings you reject, the needs you don't permit, the traits you believe you shouldn't have, the emotions that don't fit the person you think you're supposed to be. Imagine someone who believes, I don't need anybody. Where does their need for connection go? Imagine someone who believes, I never get angry. Where does their anger go? Imagine someone who believes, I always have to be strong. Where does their fear go? The answer isn't that these parts disappear. They become harder to acknowledge. And sometimes, what you refuse to consciously accept begins influencing your behavior indirectly. Your anger becomes resentment. Your fear becomes control. Your loneliness becomes emotional distance. Your need for reassurance becomes perfectionism. Your vulnerability becomes sarcasm. You don't say, I'm afraid you'll leave me. You say, I don't care. You don't say, I need you to reassure me. You say, forget it. You don't say, that really hurt. You say, it's fine. And suddenly, the emotion is still there. Only now it has a disguise. That's the strange thing about suppression. You can hide an emotion from another person. You can even temporarily hide it from yourself. But that doesn't mean the emotional need that produced it has vanished. And this leads to one of the biggest misconceptions about quiet people. People sometimes assume that someone who doesn't talk much about their emotions must not feel very deeply. But emotional expression and emotional intensity are not the same thing. Someone can feel almost nothing and talk constantly. Someone else can feel an enormous amount and say almost nothing. Silence tells you how much someone is expressing. Doesn't necessarily tell you how much they're experiencing. Some people process internally. They replay conversations. They analyze every word. They wonder whether they were unfair. They imagine what the other person meant. They think about what they should have said. They create 10 possible versions of a conversation that may never happen. And sometimes, this kind of internal processing is useful. It gives a person time to understand themselves. It prevents them from reacting impulsively. It can make their eventual words more thoughtful. But there is a darker side, because if every emotional conversation happens entirely inside your head, you can become trapped inside your own interpretation. You might spend hours wondering, did they mean that? Are they angry with me? Did I do something wrong? Should I say something? What if they think I'm needy? What if they don't care? And the other person may have absolutely no idea any of this is happening. This creates a strange paradox. You stay silent because you don't want to be misunderstood. But silence can make it impossible for someone to understand you. You stay silent because you don't want to become a burden. But you also prevent someone who loves you from deciding whether they want to help. You stay silent because you don't want rejection. But you also make genuine intimacy difficult. And perhaps the hardest part is this. People can care about you deeply and still not know you deeply. They may know your sense of humor. They know your habits. They know what you like to eat. They know what you're good at. They know how dependable you are. They know the version of you that functions. But do they know what scares you? Do they know what makes you feel small? Do they know what you secretly need? Do they know what you're still carrying? Maybe not. And this is how someone can be surrounded by people while still feeling alone. Because loneliness isn't always the absence of people. Sometimes it's the absence of being known. And being known requires some degree of vulnerability. Not complete vulnerability, not telling everyone everything, not turning your private life into public property. Just enough honesty for another person to reach the real you. But if you've spent years protecting yourself through silence, that can feel terrifying. Because vulnerability requires surrendering something you may have spent your entire life controlling. How other people perceive you. When you stay silent, you control the information. You decide what people know. You decide what they can criticize. You decide what they can misunderstand. You decide what they can use against you. But the moment you say, "I am hurt," you give someone the ability to respond. They might respond beautifully. They might disappoint you. They might misunderstand you. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes vulnerability difficult. You cannot control what another person does with your honesty. So for someone who learned early that vulnerability has consequences, silence can feel like control. And this is why simply telling someone, "Just open up," usually doesn't work. You're asking them to surrender a defense without understanding why the defense exists. You are essentially saying, give up the thing that has protected you, and the nervous system may here become vulnerable again. That's why emotional safety matters. Not because people should be allowed to avoid communication forever, but because honesty becomes much easier when a person believes their honesty won't immediately be punished. And there's another distinction we need to make. Not every silence is unhealthy. Some things are private because they are meaningful. Some emotions need time. Sometimes the wisest response is to say nothing until you understand what you're actually feeling. There is a difference between, "I don't want to talk about this," and "I wish I could talk about this, but I don't know how." There is a difference between choosing privacy and being imprisoned by fear, and maybe that's the real question to ask yourself. Not, "Why do I keep everything inside?" but, "What am I afraid would happen if I didn't? Would someone judge you? Would they think you're weak? Would they leave? Would they dismiss you? Would you lose control? Would you discover that someone you trusted doesn't actually understand you?" Or perhaps the answer is even more uncomfortable. What if you don't know what you feel until you say it out loud? For some people, that is the frightening part. They have become so accustomed to managing emotions privately that speaking them aloud makes them feel more real. Anger becomes real when you admit you're angry. Grief becomes real when you say you miss someone. Loneliness becomes real when you admit you don't want to be alone. Need becomes real when you say, "I need you." Sometimes people would rather carry the pain privately than give it a name, because once you name something, you have to decide what to do with it. And that is where emotional suppression can become a trap. You don't have to feel better. You simply have to feel less visible. But eventually, the cost can become enormous. You become excellent at functioning while struggling. You become excellent at appearing okay. You become the person everyone relies on. And nobody notices that you are exhausted, because you trained everyone to believe that you're fine. And here's the cruel irony. The better you become at hiding your pain, the less likely people are to realize you need support. Then you point to their lack of support as evidence that nobody understands you. But sometimes they don't understand because you never gave them access. That's not blame. It's the tragedy of the pattern. The behavior protects itself. You hide because you don't feel understood. People don't understand because you hide. You feel even less understood, so you hide even more, and eventually, silence starts feeding itself. Breaking that cycle doesn't mean telling everyone everything. It may begin with something much smaller, one honest sentence. I didn't like that. I actually am struggling. That hurt me. I need some time. I don't know what I'm feeling yet. I don't want advice. I just want you to listen. These aren't dramatic declarations. They're small acts of psychological honesty, and perhaps that is what real emotional strength looks like. Not the ability to carry everything alone, but the ability to recognize what you are carrying, to know when silence is serving you and when it is slowly shrinking your world, because the goal isn't to become emotionally transparent. You are allowed to have private thoughts. You are allowed to have boundaries. You are allowed to keep parts of yourself sacred. You don't owe everyone access to your inner world, but you should have at least a few places where you don't have to disappear. A person, a relationship, a space, or even your own honest awareness, because there is something worse than other people not knowing you. And that is becoming so accustomed to your persona that you stop knowing yourself. You become the strong one, the independent one, the calm one, the one who never needs anything. And then, one day you realize you have spent years becoming someone who is incredibly easy for other people to be around, but incredibly difficult for yourself to inhabit. That's the point where the Jungian idea becomes more than theory. The hidden parts of you aren't necessarily enemies. The anger may be telling you a boundary was crossed. The loneliness may be telling you that connection matters. The fear may be showing you what you care about. The need for affection may be reminding you that independence was never the whole story. The vulnerable part of you isn't necessarily the weak part. It may simply be the part you never learned how to protect without hiding. And perhaps becoming whole isn't about destroying the persona. It's about making room for everything underneath it. You can still be strong, but you don't have to be invulnerable. You can still be independent, but you don't have to pretend you need nobody. You can still be private, but you don't have to be unreachable. You can still be calm, but you don't have to be silent about everything that matters. Because the opposite of suppression isn't emotional chaos. It's awareness. It's being able to say, "This is what I feel," without immediately judging yourself for feeling it. And perhaps the greatest freedom isn't finally telling everyone everything you've kept inside. It's reaching the point where you can choose. You can say, "I want to keep this to myself." And that's okay. But you can also say, "I don't want to carry this alone anymore." And that's okay too, because then silence is no longer controlling you. You are choosing it, and that distinction changes everything. Maybe the younger version of you needed silence. Maybe it was the safest option available. Maybe keeping everything inside helped you survive a time when being vulnerable really did have consequences. You don't have to hate that version of yourself. You don't have to shame them for adapting. You can simply recognize that the strategy that once protected you may not be necessary in every room you enter today. The world changed. You changed. Some people changed. And perhaps you can slowly learn something your younger self didn't have the opportunity to learn. Not everyone who sees your vulnerability will use it against you. Not everyone will understand you perfectly. Not everyone will respond the way you hope. But some people will stay. Some people will listen. Some people will not need you to perform strength every second. And perhaps healing, in the deepest sense, isn't becoming someone who talks about everything. It's becoming someone who knows the difference between privacy and hiding, independence and isolation, silence and suppression. Someone who can finally ask, am I quiet because I have nothing to say? Or am I quiet because I am afraid of what might happen if I say it? Because those are not the same person. One is choosing silence, the other is being chosen by it. And maybe that's the real reason some people keep everything inside. Not because they have nothing to feel, not because they don't care, not because they're cold, but because somewhere along the way, silence became safer than being seen. And when something protects you for long enough, you can forget that it was ever a defense. You start calling it your personality. You start calling it strength. You start calling it independence. Until one day, you realize the thing that once protected you is now preventing people from reaching you. And that realization doesn't mean you have to throw the walls down. It simply means you finally know they're there, because the goal was never to become someone who has nothing to hide. The goal is to become someone who no longer has to hide from themselves. Silence can protect you. Silence can shape you. And sometimes silence can imprison you. The question is not whether you keep things inside. The question is, who is choosing the silence? You, or the fear that taught you to need it?